Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
All is well, all is well. First and foremost, I want to thank you for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you. I'm very interested in the work that you've been doing for, quite a few decades.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Definitely, it's an honor. It's an honor. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
My name is Michael Kazin. I'm a history professor at Georgetown University. I grew up in New York City and right outside New York City, in New Jersey. I live in Washington, D.C. now.
Oh, okay, that's cool. That's real cool. Now I can ask you this: when did you develop a passion for history and writing? Was that something you kind of got into early on in life, or did you get into it later?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I used to read the New York Times cover to cover, which is weird for a 12-year-old, but I did that. I've always liked politics, arguing about it. And then I went to college in the late 1960s and got involved in the radical movement at that time, the New Left. Um, and then when we, let's say, didn't change the country in all the ways we would have liked to change the country, I wanted to figure out what happened. So in some ways, that got me interested in looking into the American past and trying to understand what the left has done right, what the left has done wrong, and just in general, it sort of helped to feed my interest in history that I always had. But it gave me sort of, you might say, a motivation, to make my career teaching and writing about the American past.
Okay, okay. I take my hat off to you because history is very important. A lot of people take for granted how empowering it can be and how it can be a tool. We can utilize history. So I really appreciate that. Now, I can ask you this. Now, you hear terms people say left or right. What does that mean? Is that different from like Democrat and Republican, or why do
Yeah,
people
no,
use
it's
those
a
terms?
it's a good question. I shouldn't use those terms, just throwing them around. Sometimes the media does that as well, as you know. Well, left means progressive. Um, some people on the left are more liberal. They want more um, sort of smaller changes, not change things fundamentally. Radicals also on the left, they want to change things pretty fundamentally, transform the whole society. Um, Right means conservative. Sometimes people just want to keep things the way they are. Sometimes, like Donald Trump, they want to go backwards, make America great again, assuming it was ever great. But anyway, that's a different question. And the terms derived from the French Revolution, actually, in 1789, where the king, the monarchy was overthrown. And in 1789, and then there was the first popular assembly, elected assembly, and the people who were not part of the aristocracy or part of the clergy sat on the left, and those who were part of the the established order, if you will, who had supported the king before, and then they were elected to the French Assembly, they sat on the right, and ever since then, people have used those terms to describe, progressive on one hand, conservative on the other hand.
Oh, okay. Wow. I appreciate you breaking that down. Now, I wanted to ask you about some of your projects you worked on. I checked your credits and you listed as an author, as an editor. Now, what exactly is the role of an editor? Because I think a lot of people, readers, they may take for granted, the responsibility that an editor has in the book that they're reading.
Yeah, without editors, a lot of authors would would fall on their faces, one way or another. Editors help to craft what you're doing. They correct mistakes in either the way you use the language. They suggest changes in what you've done. They say, well, you got 5 points in this article. Maybe cut it down to one. You've got you go off on tangents. You're going off too far away from the main point. So editors sort of keep you on message, so to speak. And a good editor does that. And also, a good editor learns a lot about what you've written about, or knows already about a lot of what you've written about, and can help to say, well, you forgot about this or something else. So really, a writer's only as good as his editor in some ways. And if you don't think you need an editor, you're wrong.
Wow.
By the way,
Wow. Okay.
as you know, they're also video editors, right? And in a sense, producers on um, on records, on music also, editors. Well, they're not called editors, but they are in effect, because they're always making changes, small changes, in what the artist creates.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Now I can ask you this. Now you actually edited for Princeton. Now what is that like in comparison to just editing maybe say like one author's work or one
Yeah,
book?
that's different. That's I edited this 2-volume history of American politics. And we had to, I didn't do it by myself. I had 2 other people helping me, but I was the main editor. We had to contact dozens, maybe over 100, I forget how many there were, different historians who were specialists in different areas, whether it be African American politics, or Protestant politics, or the politics of the Midwest, or politics of different political parties, Federalists, Democrats, Whigs, Republicans, et cetera. We wanted to sort of cover the waterfront, so to speak. Wanted to make sure that, mostly for students, that if you went to college, you wanted like a good 2,000-word summary of a particular aspect of American political history, you could find it. Kind of like Wikipedia, but I think Wikipedia written by people who spent their lives studying a certain subject, as opposed to folks who just have an interest in it. And if you're part of a university library, college library, some high school libraries too, you can download the articles for this on this encyclopedia for free.
Wow. Okay. Okay. That's cool. That's cool. Now I can ask you about your latest project. What it took to win. Now you actually won the Editor's Choice by New York Times. If you could talk about what inspired you to write that, and
Sure. Well, I've always been, not always, but mostly I've been someone who voted for Democrats with a capital D, and sympathize with them, not because they're a perfect party, because I think they've, at least in my lifetime, almost always been better than the Republican Party. And and we have a 2-party system, so it's difficult to support a third party, which is not going to win. And I wanted to understand why, when they were successful in American history, they've been around for over 200 years as a mass political party, why they've been successful. And also, my son was an inspiration. He went to college. He worked on Obama's campaign in 2008, and since then he's been made his living working for Democrats, managing their campaigns. Now he's a consultant, helping to make ads for Democratic candidates. Also, I learned a lot from him about sort of the insides of the party. How the party actually functions, and that's something I didn't really know much about before. I wrote it partly from personal interest, as I said, familial interest, if you will, and partly just because I don't think nobody had really written a book like this before, surprisingly. There's so many books about presidents, about social movements, about all kinds of aspects of the political past, but no books, hardly any books about institutions. And without the institutions, politics, doesn't really work. You can argue whether it works or not, but nevertheless, those institutions really matter. Of course, they're the ones who really structure, the politics that we have. So I wanted to write about the history of that institution, Democratic Party.
Wow, okay, that's amazing. I mean, you actually got to write about something that you have a passion for, and you got a chance to work with your son. People dream of being able to do things like that. That's really inspiring. Let me see. Now I wanted to ask you this. Now, when we have these elections, like you say, is 2 parties. Is it a matter of a significant amount of people switching from one party to the other party, or is it more so, a new wave of people voting for, maybe their interests? Say, like, if this law is passed and they want to, amend that law or get it changed, so they vote in the opposite direction.
That's a great question. In order to win um, national power in this country, in our country, with only 2 parties, you need a pretty broad coalition, actually, to win. And when the Democrats were successful, they wore that broad coalition. Um, the first time was before the Civil War, when they were a broad coalition of white people. Of course, most of them supported enslavement, but they were the majority party among white voters, and white voters, of course, the majority of people who were voting at the time. Very few non-whites could vote. But then more recently, from 1930s up until through the 1960s, they were able to attract a much broader coalition. For the first time, they jettisoned at least parts of their racist past, and they became the party of labor unions, which they had been for the first time. Labor unions sort of attached themselves, anchored themselves to a political party. They became the party of white ethnic minorities like Jews and Italians and Poles and other groups, some of whom were in labor unions at the time as well. And they became the party that sort of wanted to expand the government in order to help ordinary people through Social Security, through later on Medicare, making it easier to organize labor unions, various public works projects, public housing projects, and so forth. And so that is in the way in which they became the majority party from the early 1930s up through the 1960s. And the Republicans did that to a degree earlier in American history as well, when they put together a coalition of African-American voters when they could still vote in the South, and business interests in the Northeast, and a lot of industrial workers also who liked the high tariffs, the high that were put on imported goods. So American manufactured goods were cheaper than goods coming from abroad. So it's really a coalition which is you need to win election in this country more than one time, at least. You need a coalition of people who people who disagree about a lot of things very often, but they agree about one or two big things, and they certainly have leaders too, who can unite them, the way Franklin Roosevelt did, for example, in the 1930s and 1940s, and John Kennedy did for a while, at least in the early 1960s, before he was assassinated.
Wow, wow. I appreciate you breaking that down. Now, I understand that the book came out in 2022, so I could just ask you maybe if it's okay, what are your thoughts on the Democratic Party and the upcoming election?
Oh, I have no thoughts about that at all. I mean, it just, uh, well, as you might know, I know this will probably be um, uh, put up later, but Kamala Harris just named a vice president today, Tim Walz from Minnesota, and it's a pretty progressive ticket, I think. At least that's how it's going to be perceived, and a ticket which is very much behind a lot of the initiatives that Joe Biden began, and for all kinds of reasons, a lot of them didn't get passed. So it's a really more progressive ticket, actually, than Democrats have had in a long time. And that could be good, it could be bad. I mean, that's a matter of, we're a country, pretty 50-50 country. So to win, you need people who are not on the left, who are not progressives, who are moderates in those swing states that decide the election, as you know. So I'm optimistic. I think that certainly Joe Biden dropping out was a really good thing because he was not going to win. Kamala Harris has injected a lot of excitement into the party. Got a lot of people who perhaps were not going to vote now more enthused about voting. And Walz has a sense of humor, which is nice to have. You don't want you want your politicians to be able to make fun of the other side. People laugh at what they're saying. Trump did that to a degree, and that's part of the reason why a lot of Republicans like him. So, like it or not, we're a society that likes entertainment, right? We like performance, and you gotta get people to stand up and take notice. And Walz sort of pushed his candidacy online pretty much, over the last couple of weeks. So, but at the same time, as I said before, I'm going on too long here. Sorry about that. But the Democrats still have to convince a lot of people in the country that they have their best interests at heart, and they have to convince people that they can change what people aren't happy about, whether it's inflation for some people, undocumented migrants coming over the border, just a general sense a lot of Americans have that, as you see in polls, that America's on the wrong track. That term, and that's making people optimistic again about what can happen in the country. That's something that is not easy to do. When people are down, they're cynical, they're skeptical. That's not easy to do. And so that's one thing they have to do, whether they win the election or not. They've got to do that.
Okay, okay. And let me see. I wanted to ask you about another project that you had. This was in 2017. You won the Editor's Choice by the NY Times again. You know, congratulations on that. It's called War Against War. What inspired you to write that, and what exactly is that about?
It's about the Americans who opposed U.S. entering World War One, which at the time was the biggest war in history. It was called the Great War, at the time, because there had never been a war in which almost every country was involved, one way or another. And the centennial of U.S. entering the war was coming up. It was in 1917, the U.S. entered World War One. Excuse me. And so I knew 2017 was coming up. I thought, I'd like to read about those who opposed the war, which in retrospect, I think was a bad idea for the U.S. to enter that war. And I couldn't find any book. There was no book that did what I wanted to do. And that's something historians, you say, hey, this is an important subject. No one's written about it before. Here I go. So I put together a book which looked at, again, a broad coalition of people who, for different reasons, didn't want the U.S. to enter the war. But also important to remember that this was a pretty unusual thing. The U.S., of course, has been involved in a lot of wars, wars of conquest of Native Americans, the Mexican War, Civil War, of course, Spanish-American War. But World War I was the first time American troops were sent overseas to fight in a war. And this is a war that had been going on already by the time the U.S. entered it for almost 3 years. It began in 1914, summer of 1914. So it was an interesting coalition. I won't go into all the details about it, but because it involved people who were sort of strange bedfellows. On the one hand, socialists and black activists like Ida B. Wells, for example, A. Philip Randolph, who later on became, a very important labor leader. And on the other hand, arch segregationists in the South who didn't like the idea of having, an integrated army, which of course wasn't an integrated army, but they're afraid black men would get guns. They didn't like that idea. And also it was a war for a lot of people thought it was a war only for the rich. It was make money for arms makers, make money for the big banks, loaning money to the government, this kind of thing. So there are a lot of reasons to oppose the war. The movement didn't succeed, of course, because the U.S. did enter the war. But because the war was relatively unpopular, when the U.S. entered the war, the government cracked down on those who opposed it. A lot of the people I wrote about put thousands of people in jail, basically put anti-war newspapers out of business. It was the most repressive period politically in American history. And so I wanted to write about that side of it as well.
Wow, wow. I never knew that. Yeah, like you say, no one had really written about that part of it. People getting thrown in jail for opposing the war, especially World War One. You
Right.
kind of hear about that maybe like during Vietnam, people protesting and stuff like that.
And
Wow,
actually,
that's
one other little thing about that compared to Vietnam, because I was, of course, I'm an old guy. I was alive during Vietnam and opposed the war, but that's probably the reason I wrote about it too, I think. But there were more people who resisted the draft in World War One than resisted the draft during the Vietnam War. But in World War One, more people can get away with it because a lot of people had no birth certificate. They were born at home. It was hard to find them. So, so the best estimate still is about 250,000 American men who were supposed to be drafted in World War One. Some evaded the draft one way or another, and I always thought that was amazing when I discovered that.
wow. Okay, okay. Let me see. We're about 20 minutes in. I wanted to ask you about another book. Okay, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. Who
Mm-hmm.
exactly is that, and what made you select him to write about?
Sure. Well, he ran for president for the Democrats 3 times, 1896, 1900, 1908. He's an interesting figure. He was, maybe you've heard, other folks have heard about the Scopes trial, the so-called Scopes monkey trial, 1925. Tennessee had passed a law saying you couldn't teach the theory of evolution in public schools in Tennessee. And Bryan, though he was very progressive in a lot of political issues, especially economic issues, was a fundamentalist Protestant. And so he was the main prosecution attorney in this trial in Tennessee, trying this teacher in Tennessee, in East Tennessee, who had taught from a book about evolution. And his opposing attorney was kind of Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous sort of left-wing attorneys in American history. And I want to write about Bryan because I was interested in this combination of being someone who wanted to nationalize the railroads. He supported labor unions. He supported a lot of relief for small farmers, kind of a New Dealer ahead of his time in a way. At the same time, he was, thought the Bible was true as written, and he thought it was very bad for children to go to school and learn that they were not created by God, but that they created as a process of evolution. So he thought they would learn to be immoral people because of that. So that combination, excuse me, of sort of left wing and a lot of political issues and very conservative in terms of theology. I thought that was an interesting thing. And also, he was beloved by a lot of people. When he ran for president, he would get 5,000 letters a day, fan mail, from people, because people saw him as kind of a prophet. The title of the biography I wrote is called "A Godly Hero," and I don't think he was a godly hero. I don't think he was godly. I don't believe in that. But a lot of his followers saw him that way. So in that sense, he was a very charismatic figure, and that's interesting to me too. People who are, even though he didn't get elected president, he was personally sort of an idol of a lot of Americans.
Oh, okay. Wow, wow. That's very, very interesting. Okay, now I wanted to ask you about one more book, America Divided, the Civil War of 1960s.
Yeah, well, this is a survey of the history of the 60s. I wrote with a good friend of mine from way back in the 60s, Morris Isserman. And, the excuse me, the subtitle maybe sounds a little too present-minded today. The Civil War of the 1960s. Some people talking about we're headed towards another Civil War. I don't think so, but nevertheless. And of course, there wasn't a real Civil War in the 60s. That's just a metaphor. It wasn't like the actual Civil War, which took place 100 years before. But America was pretty damn divided in the 60s. People who supported Black freedom, people who opposed it, people who supported the Vietnam War, people who opposed it, people who opposed the counterculture, people who opposed it, people who loved rock and soul music, people thought it was the devil music. Culturally, politically, socially, racially, there were huge divisions in the 1960s, and some of them were still with us. Like abortion, for example. Or how you teach about history in school. And so we wanted in courses that still get taught about the 1960s. We thought this should be a good book. Would cover, and we didn't just cover the stuff people think about a lot, like anti-war movement, the Black freedom movement, the women's movement, social movements like that. We also talked about religion in the 60s, a whole chapter on that. Got a whole chapter on the conservative movement in the 60s, which was growing as well at the time. So we tried to cover all the really important topics and talk about how divided America was, rather than looking at it sort of in a rosy view. Oh, things were going great, things were changing. Yeah, things were changing, but it was a period of tremendous conflict as well.
Yeah, definitely. It was a lot going on in the 60s, man. Okay,
Yeah,
now I
because
can ask you.
I was a
Uh-huh.
kid. I was a kid too. I was in college in the late 60s, and I grew up in I was in high school in the mid 60s. So it was partly, again, we came at it, from that personal interest as well.
Yeah, that's even better. You was there, so let me see. Now I can ask you, have you ever thought about doing like a documentary based on any of your books or, the research and stuff that you have done?
I've been interviewed for documentaries. Recently interviewed for one on the Vietnam War. It's going to be on Netflix next year, I think. But you gotta get resources for that. You gotta raise money for that. And if you write a book, you just sit down. I sit down here at my laptop and write and do research, and so it's a much bigger production, right? To do a documentary, I love to work with somebody on a documentary about one of those topics. Certainly, when I wrote that biography of William Jennings Bryan, I had emails back and forth with Ken Burns about doing a documentary about him, but in the end, he decided not to. But I'd love to work with someone about it, but I don't think I don't have the resources, and I don't have the skills to make one myself.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like making a documentary. It can be expensive because I had looked into it one time. Like I think like to lease like 60 seconds worth of footage, archive footage. It could start off at like 3,000, per minute. So if
I
you
forgot
want
about
thirty
that part.
minutes,
I forgot about that part.
yeah,
Yeah. Um,
and
and also, documentaries, people to see them, they got to be really good. There's so many documentaries out there you can find on Netflix, find on YouTube, and you get 100 views, 200 views, and people work for years on those, and then to be crass about it, nobody really watches them, and so what's the point?
yeah, that's true too. So many of them coming out. Now I can ask you, are you working on any books right now? Do you have any books coming up?
Well, I'm in the middle of a book about the rise of the American labor movement in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Focused on another kind of controversial figure, Samuel Gompers, who was a immigrant from Great Britain. He founded the American Federation of Labor, and he had a lot of battles with people more to his left, with radicals of various kinds about what kind of labor movement there should be. But I began doing labor history, history of working people in America, and I think it's still an important issue, and I'm very in favor of labor unions. I think more workers should be in labor unions because they can get better pay and more job security if they're in unions. So I want to understand how that began in America in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So that's what I'm working on now.
Wow, wow, that's very interesting as well. Yeah, that's something people gonna always have to deal with. Labor, people want to work, people need jobs and stuff like that. So yeah, we're about 30 minutes in. So I want to thank you again so much for everything that you have contributed to history, everything you got going on in the works, and also for taking your time out to come on the platform. I really appreciate
I appreciate it, and I like your questions a lot. It's always great, and you ask someone to talk about their work. So it's great to have that opportunity to do that. Thank you.
you. Yeah, it's an honor, and I want to thank the viewers for tuning in. So until next time, peace.